Welcome to the 2005 AMI Monetary Reform Conference. Big welcome to all of you. Now, I'm Stephen Zarlenga, Director and co-founder of the American Monetary Institute, author of The Lost Science of Money book. And I call this meeting with the support of our advisors and helpers because of the direction of world events, including Bush's unleashing the dogs of war, because it requires that action be taken now to identify the source of so many of the world's crises and to begin action to correct it. The real source, our unjust and foolish monetary system. A year ago, Robert McNamara, who was President Kennedy's Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War, warned us in the Fog of War film documentary interviews that there was only one thing that stopped an all-out nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he said, the only thing that saved us was blind luck. Blind luck. Civilization was again spared in September of '83 when Russian Lieutenant Colonel Petrov refused to obey launch orders in response to a mistaken warning of a U.S. missile attack. And again, civilization was saved. Well, ladies and gentlemen, our civilization, all of it, is living on borrowed time. We're living on borrowed time because for a long time we've been living on borrowed money. We've allowed private bankers the power to lend us our own money system and thereby control our society. But there's nothing in their background or training or souls that qualifies them for such power. And look how this system has unjustly concentrated the nation's wealth into the hands of a corrupt financial elite, an elite that has ignored crucial infrastructure, for example, the New Orleans levees that we now see what happens, and has led us to the brink of disaster. We must enact monetary reforms that reverse this concentrating process and allow our productive power to be properly used. Reforms that put time on the side of justice instead of against it, as at present, to move back from the brink of nuclear destruction, away from a future dominated by fraud and ugliness, and toward a future of justice and beauty. That's why I'm here, and I hope your presence signifies something similar. Now, the American Monetary Institute. Wow. Thank you. The AMI is a publicly supported charity. We're structured like the Red Cross. We started in '96 for the independent study of monetary history, theory, and reform. Emphasis on independent, because for whatever reason, perhaps connected with funding, universities have not been able to make significant progress in monetary studies or monetary reform. Part of the problem is that economics has been degenerating into what could be considered a clandestine religion rather than a science, where the market is considered omnipotent, omniscient, and all beneficial, which are attributes of a god. The market has been deified. Now, AMI continues only as long as public support comes in, and so by necessity, we are always in fundraising mode. And we will do our best at this conference at some point to raise funds here too. We've had to go into just a bit of debt to hold this conference. We like to wipe it off if we can. Our research was published in late 2002, The Lost Science of Money book, and here's what we found in broad terms. We found a grand ongoing struggle over the control of money systems from at least Aristotle's time. We found that the battle is fought through language, where definitions serve as heavy artillery. that by misdefining the nature of money, corrupt groups seize control of society's monetary system and then the entire society, deforming humanity in the process. That the main battle line is private control of the money system versus public control of the money system. We found that the modern attack on government appears to have been launched to keep the monetary power in the then privately held Bank of England. We saw that a society's concept of money determines whether its money system is going to be privately controlled to enrich the few or publicly controlled for the common good. If you define money as wealth, for example, gold, the wealthy are going to control not just their money, they're going to control the monetary system. Define money as monetized bank credits, our banking system does at this time, and the bankers will control it. If you define money, what we consider correctly, as an abstract social power based in law, then the society can control the money system for the good of all. Now, money's nature must dictate monetary reform. Our method examines historical case studies as the facts on which theories have to be faced. And our method, importantly, pays attention to the morality of money systems, not just to their mechanics. On page 656 of our book, we summarize what money is, what it is we're trying to reform. And first we note our inheritance from past genius. From Aristotle, money exists not by nature, but by law. From Plato, a money token for the purposes of exchange. From Paulus of the Roman Empire, this device, being officially promulgated, circulated, maintained its purchasing power not so much from its substance as from its quantity. Then, after a long darkness, from Anglican Bishop Berkeley, whether the true idea of money as such be not altogether that of a ticket or counter. From Locke and Franklin, who viewed money as a pledge for wealth rather than wealth itself. From Knapp, George Knapp, our test that the money is accepted in payments made to the state's offices. From Delmar, we have a sufficient definition, which is the following. What is commonly understood as money has always consisted tangibly of a number of pieces of some material marked by public authority and named or understood in the laws or customs, that its palpable characteristic was its mark of authority, its essential characteristic, the possession of value defined by law, and its function, the legal power to pay debts and taxes, and the mechanical power to facilitate the exchange of other objects possessing value. We accept all of these concepts in our concept of money, and we add, money's essence, apart from whatever is used to signify it, is an abstract social power embodied in law as an unconditional means of payment. You could call this a societal or constitutional concept of money. Regarding the morality of money systems, the money system is society's greatest dispenser of justice or injustice. A good one will function fairly. It'll help create values for life. A bad one or unjust one will obstruct the creation of values, will give special privileges to some at the expense of others, will lead to strife and warfare. It'll cause unfair concentrations of wealth and power and give you 1,000 unforeseen bad consequences, both physical and spiritual. Wait. Wow. And we take our cue from the Archbishop of Canterbury's 1942 call for the nationalization of the Bank of England. Here it was, 1942, had to be the middle of World War II. Bombs are falling, V-2 rockets are coming in on London. Planes are coming over, attacking all the time. What does the Archbishop of Canterbury do? Calls for the nationalization of the Bank of England, naturally. I think 2 world wars and a Great Depression, all in a span of 35 years, was just too much, even for the Archbishop of Canterbury. And what he said was the following: what should be the servant has become the master. What should be the servant has become the master. Now, Amy's intention is that money should be the servant of humanity, of mankind. And that's the reason that monetary reform is of such great paramount importance, because when held privately, it simply concentrates too much power into private hands. It creates a plutocracy, the rule by wealth. Our system's based on a better idea, which includes citizens' rights, includes fair dealing in commercial, in legal, in social matters. This conference begins the modern movement for monetary reform in America with a different approach. Reformers focusing on economic justice already know most of the broad shapes that monetary reform should take. Views that have withstood the test of time and logic and history, and various careful researchers keep coming back to these same conclusions independently over periods of hundreds of years sometimes. Rather than argue forever over these main themes, it's time for those of us who understand to move forward and implement those elements that we know must be a part of good monetary reform. The broad parameters supported by, I would say, 3,000 years of history are that the control of money systems should shift away from private control and special privilege toward public control through government, away from commodity money ideas toward legal systems, away from monetizing private credits, loaning them into circulation at interest, towards having the government create the money directly, interest-free, spending it into circulation to promote the general welfare. Now, we can't know every detail that reform will take, but we know enough already to assure superior results to what we have at the present time. Our present monetary system, for example, values a typical middle-class house in California at over $1 million. It doesn't make sense. Now, rather than arguing with those who are essentially representing opposing interests, it's time to move forward with a solid long-term program. We can't wait for other people to do this. There is nobody else that's going to do this. We're the ones that are being waited for to do this. The bigger challenge for us is not to know what to do, but how to do it, because frankly, we don't have that much experience in political action. But we're going to learn. And so these annual conferences will seek out some speakers with that kind of experience. We'll present the improvements that we can expect from a better money system, for example, infrastructure that includes sustainable, environmentally sound transport systems, farming parity programs, and each time we identify a new area, we also find a new group of good people working in that area who then become interested in monetary reform and become a part of this movement for monetary justice. So our objectives with the conferences are present the information on 3 areas: the reforms, achieving them politically, showing what we use them for. This information is going to be duplicated in print, videos, DVDs to be used around the country in monetary education and political action groups. We'll hold regional and local conferences. I counted them up. I was surprised. I've held meetings in 17 cities since February of 2004. We will accelerate that to help build monetarily aware, politically active movement out there so that when the situation becomes ready in Washington, there'll exist substantial, informed support around the country. Now, we're just a handful of people here. But what if we had groups active in 190 cities by the year 2010? Well, how would it be possible to do that? Our goal is that that we're able to develop in 2006 12 cities where there are informed monetary groups doing studying and learning how to talk to their lawmakers. 24 in 2007, 4 in 2008, and so on. That gets us up to 192 cities by 2010, which is a remarkable number, and yet it's only 4 cities per state. That's quite a doable thing. And you simply need to have the right structures, and you need a bit of financial support. There are at least 2 people in this room who know how to build that kind of a system. And one of them is my old friend here, Oli Makaprang. And I described this to Oli on the phone the other day. He's in Europe. He's speaking later. And Oli said, he answered me, "Oh, you're going to use the Jesus Christ system, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." Now, some of you must know what the Jesus Christ system is. Anybody? 1, 2, 3. Great. 4. Holy knows. The Jesus Christ system is a 4-word system, and how Christianity was built. And if you know it, you can repeat it with me. It's just 4 words. First word is each one tell one. Okay? It's very simple. Can you repeat that with me? All right, loud. Each one tell one. Just once a year, and we double every year. Twice a year, and we move faster. All right. All of you are welcome to join this adventure for monetary and economic justice. It really can't come out of leaders on their own. It's difficult for this stuff to come out of Washington. It's got to start with us out here. And then they'll come and they'll be a part of this. This is how we move forward solidly without depending on corporate media. Because what the media gives, the media can take. What the media gives, the media can and does control. No thanks. We don't need them. They need us more than we need them. Which is not to say that we're going to miss opportunities of getting the message out through them. German TV wanted to come here and film parts of this. And instead, we may have convinced them to come and do a whole documentary at a certain point. Now, I want to make some acknowledgments. One reason, you see that we're being video recorded here, and one reason that we're being video recorded is this may become historically important as the beginning of a movement. And this is Mr. Chad Ely here, who is on the video camera. Chad is one of the world's foremost internet experts. He has just created our new website, and if you haven't seen it yet, go and take a look. It's just fabulous. Mr. Ely has done the media for Ralph Nader, for three presidential candidates, Ralph Nader, John Kerry, and Dennis Kucinich. And for us to have him here represents a major, major thing. Chad is going to be an important part of the future of the American Monetary Institute. So if you're going to give anyone applause, give it to... Thank you, Chad, for being here. Several of Amy's advisors are here. Professor Bob Blaine, and Ken Bonsack, and Ben Giesen, who are up here. These fellows are fellows that I can call on any time of day or night, and they're there to give help and advice. And they're all speakers, so we'll be introducing them in more detail at that time. We'll acknowledge all of our speakers, but at this point I want to say to all of our speakers, every single one of you, thank you for coming. And thank you for the help you're going to give us in making this a success to the extent that we do. I want to recognize and acknowledge the really essential help of my assistant, Elizabeth. If you would stand up, please, Elizabeth. Elizabeth started with AMI 6 months ago as Miss Elizabeth Harper from London and has since become Mrs. Elizabeth Kucinich of Cleveland in a really exciting and fairy tale love story that we've had the privilege of watching from close up here. Elizabeth will be making some announcements later and will help to keep our sessions on schedule. David Hershey is here, and Dr. Lewis Coleman. Are you here yet, Lewis? Lewis not here yet. Lewis will be in here. Their support helped make possible the publication of The Lost Science of Money book. Thank you. We have an honor roll of persons whose financial support helped make the conference possible. We'll read that later. The co-founder of the American Monetary Institute is here, Dr. Lucien de Wolf. If you'll stand up, Lucien. Without Lucien, there would be no American Monetary Institute, no conference, and no book. I thank David Kendall, Greg Young, Ken Bonsack, who came in early to help with logistics and registrations. And of course, I strongly acknowledge all of you here in attendance. This is about you and about developing ways that we can work together to hand a better America to the next generation. And as we fulfill that sacred duty, I intend that we have a good time doing it. Here's just some general ground rules. Please remain polite even if discussions get intense, which they might. Various chairmen of the sessions will keep the speakers on schedule, even though I've started this late, concerning their times. In question periods, please keep your questions on the speaker's subject matter. Try to make sure they're really questions if you can, and keep them to the point. Okay, right. I think we're ready. Let's get started. Our first panel is on the Federal Reserve System, and Mr. Kenneth Bonsack will introduce everyone. I'm going to introduce Ken very briefly as the creator and organizer of the sovereignty proposal, and we're going to talk a lot more about that later. Thank you, Ken.
Good afternoon. We're here to discuss a money system, a system of enormous power that has been given over as a privilege to the few to the harm of the many. We're gathering together as a team because I believe we have the same goals. We have different and various ideas on how to correct this system. I also believe that we have a true dedication to what we want to accomplish, and we're informed. And if we work together, and if we can come away from this conference doing more than just eat, meet, and retreat. Instead, we can have a swelling of pride within our heart that we have contributed as a team in the effort of changing a hurtful system and into a helpful one. Here in our own U.S. Constitution, it reads, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, promote the general welfare." So for the balance of this conference, we lay aside our well-earned titles and positions that we have back home and are anxious and honored to contribute together. And how appropriate that we're meeting here in Chicago, because the perfect example was set for us in the 1990s, a perfect example in a form of one of the greatest basketball players ever to perform in the National Professional League. He performed not for self, not to gather the individual honors that he could have had hand over fist, but he learned how to perform for the general welfare. And his team was elevated to capture 6 championships of the world. A perfect example of what we can do, because individually you too have the power as he did. He was an enormous power, just like this money system is an enormous power. But if it's handled and harnessed and directed correctly, that we can do that. There are many aspects to what's wrong with the Federal Reserve. Let's start then, one piece at a time. And I start with introducing you to Bill Hickson. Bill.
Thank you, Ken. My remarks are about our money supply. Our money supply has three important components: our coinage, our cash, and our money in the bank. And it's those three that I want to talk about. This is all paper money. It's all man-made. It has no intrinsic value, but it needs none. It is overseen, managed, engineered, manipulated by the Federal Reserve, with the exception of the coinage, which is primarily in the hands of the Treasury Department directly. The Fed seized almost everything in connection with these other two elements of our money supply. It determines the amount of annual increase in each of the two components, and of course, the amount of annual increase in the total of the two. So now a few words about these two components. Currency held by the public is another name for the first component that I want to talk about. It's our Federal Reserve notes, our 1, 2, 5, 10, 20, 50, and $100 legal tender notes issued directly by the Fed. Currency held by the public now exceeds $700 billion. That's money created by the Fed since 1934, when we went off the gold standard. That amount will probably increase by 40, perhaps 45 billion during this year. The interesting thing about our currency, about our legal tender, is that the Fed creates the absolute minimum that it can create and still maintain the liquidity of the system. And of course, it's vital to maintain the liquidity of the system. When you go to the bank and write a check for cash, you expect to get cash, and the Fed is responsible for seeing that the cash is there, along with the banks, of course. This keeping the increase in our currency to the minimum, of course, deprives the federal government of a great part of the bonanza that goes to anybody with the money-creating power. And this is the great worry that we should have with the way the Federal Reserve performs. Now, all of you have heard the expression or the statement that if we want to reduce the annual deficit, we must cut spending or raise taxes. But it's simply not true. Since 1934, the government has spent this $700 billion that the Fed has created, and it hasn't cost the taxpayers a cent. And of course, the great tragedy of all of this is that in that length of time, while the government spent $700 billion, it could have created and spent twice that, 4 times that, 8 times that, or perhaps some even a little higher figure. And it's the fact that this hasn't been done that should be one of the principal worries of this conference, in my view. Now let's turn to the second component, bank deposits. I use the figure 7,000 billion for the total sum of bank deposits. It's arguable there are some items that some people think should be included and some that shouldn't, but it's a good figure to think that the Fed has created 700 billion, but the banks have created 7,000 billion. And if it's off a few percentage points, I don't think we need to worry about it. Even the dictionaries have trouble with monetary problems. Look up bank in your dictionary sometime. Mine says a bank is a business institution that takes deposits, safeguards deposits, and makes loans. And almost immediately, you infer from that what the bank is doing is loaning the deposits. Now, tomorrow I'll have more to say about the history of the banking system. But at this moment, I think it should suffice to say, if you go to the bank and borrow, let's say $100,000, the banker gives you a deposit slip. It says that he has created a deposit in your name. And when he does that, the deposits of the banking system go up $100,000. And the money supply goes up $100,000. And it's money purely and simply created by the banks. Another little aspect of this that's worth noting is that the 700 billion of money held by the public is money that has been withdrawn from banks. Ordinarily, people do not take cash to banks. They go to banks to get cash. And over the period since 1934, they have withdrawn $700 billion more cash from banks than they have deposited with the banks. So it's a little difficult to see how the bank could have loaned $7 trillion if all this money is being withdrawn and not deposited, left on deposit with them. As I say tomorrow, I will have further remarks on the banking system and how money creation by banks works, although I presume that most of you are already familiar with that. Now, the fact that the amount of money created by the government is 700 billion and the amount created by the banks is roughly 7,000 billion is all the responsibility of the Fed. There's no real way that we can get around that. There are constraints on the Fed to create the amount of cash that it creates in order to maintain the liquidity of the system. But the bank has all sorts of tools that it could use to limit the amount of money that's created by the banking system, and it doesn't choose to use them. And so we have this terrible situation where the government creates only about a tenth of our money supply, and the banks create the remainder. That, I think, is the central theme of our conference, and that is we want to see the percentage of all money creation that takes place in this country to be a greater amount of creation by the government and a lesser amount of creation by the banking system. And only the Fed can engineer that, and being an organization of the bankers, by the bankers, and for the bankers, they're not very likely to do it. Now, while that's the central theme, I have a pet peeve that I have to add before I sit down. This is not, of course, as important as the first point I've already made, but one thing that rankles me particularly is that our government allows banks to create money and then borrows that money from the banks and pays interest on that money to the banks when the government could have created the money industry for itself. I call that idiotic. It's imbecilic. It's just stupid to the nth degree. And it's quite a sum of money that's involved here. The government has borrowed from the banks something like $1.25 trillion. This year it will pay the banks something on the order of $55 billion in interest. And that adds up, or it comes down, to about 125 or 150 million dollars a day in interest that the government is paying, and altogether unnecessarily. So I say again that that's the federal government. Yes, state and local governments, of course, have other debts in addition to that. But if we can't stop the government from letting banks create money and borrowing it from them and paying them interest on it, when the government could create the money for itself, then I don't know how we're going to accomplish much else, and I think we need to put this at the top of the agenda. Thank you.
I'll introduce myself. My name is Dick Distelhorst. I'm from Burlington, Iowa, and I've known about the monetary problem for a number of years. What I want to address primarily today is how we can let the public know that this problem exists. You're here today because you understand that there is a problem. But we have about 300 million people in this country, and I'd say 99.9% of them don't even realize that there is a problem. So how can we explain fractional reserve banking to them without their eyes starting to glaze over? I don't know whether you've had that experience, but I've had it. When you try to explain how the fractional reserve banking system works, it doesn't take long for them to lose interest because they just don't follow it mathematically. Maybe we don't teach enough math in school. But I have found one way recently that does seem to turn on the light bulb and they realize what's happening to them. And here's the way I start. I've just been doing this. I've tested it now on about 50 people, and I'm getting pretty much the same reaction across the board. And the light bulb does turn on, and they do begin to see that there is a severe problem. First of all, I say, well, how are we going to pay for the war and all this hurricane damage? And then I say to them, whether you realize it or not, every year hundreds of billions of new U.S. dollars are put into circulation. I went back and reviewed it with the Federal Reserve's reports. And for the last 5 years, on the average, 689 billion new dollars were created each year. The money supply went up by that much each year. This is a simple fact. It's on record with the Federal Reserve System. And then I say there are two ways these new dollars can be put into circulation. Option one would be have the money created by the government and let it spend the money into circulation as a tax-free dividend for all. And option two is have the government give the money to the banking system free of charge and then let them loan our money back to us with an interest charge attached, with the result being an increase in our total interest-bearing debt. This is how our fractional reserve system works. Which option would you choose? Believe me, everyone I've spoken to chooses option number one. But the interesting thing is that Congress has 3 times at least chosen option number two. That's the reason we have the system today. The Congress voted it in 1791, and the Second Bank of the United States, I forget, in 1800 and something, and then the Federal Reserve System in 1913. But the reason they do is money. This is what we're up against when we try to get this job done. The people that we're opposing that have control of the monetary system are the most powerful economically and politically in this country. It's not going to be an easy job. We have to get public support. That's why I'm not explaining this to you because I think you already understand it. This is the way I'm trying to get people that I sometimes I've talked to before, other times that are brand new. After I present this much, then I say, did you ever play the game Monopoly? In that game, how many of you have never played Monopoly? One? Okay.
I knew when I was 6 years old that was a bad game.
Okay. Well, anyhow, this is something that most people understand. In that game, the way it works, the banker gives each player $1,500 to start the game. That's like option number one, having the government spend the money into circulation. And then each time you go around the board and pass go, the banker gives you another $200. That's also like the government spending it into circulation. Now let's change the rules of monopoly to where it works like option number 2, like our present monetary system, and have the banker loan all the money into circulation. Instead of giving each player $1,500, he lends each player $1,500 with an interest charge attached, say 10%, because that's easy to figure. And each time anyone passes go, he lends them another $200, also at 10% interest. And each time anyone passes go, he also collects 10% on how much he has already loaned to them. Who do you think's going to wind up the richest player in the game? This is what the fractional reserve banking system does. It puts us in a position where the more money we have, the deeper in debt we are. The more times you go around go, the deeper in debt you get because it's all being loaned into circulation. And we are paying interest on every dollar of this debt, which is increasing exponentially. So what is fractional reserve banking? I'm not going to explain it. I'm going to tell you where you can see it explained, because the explaining is what turns the glaze into the eyes. Fractional reserve banking began about 400 years ago with the Goldsmith bankers. The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago published an informative booklet titled Modern Money Mechanics. This is it. It's the only copy I have left. It's out of print. They don't publish it anymore. But fortunately, it is on the internet. And if you write down, I know you all have pads and pencils, write down 3 words, modern money mechanics. Put it in quotation marks and go to Google, the search engine Google, and type that in, and this booklet will come up and you can read it. And it explains and proves exactly what I'm saying about how the monetary system works. So the other thing is that this gives validity and credibility to what you're saying when you say that we give away our own money free of charge and then borrow it back at an interest rate. This booklet explains in detail how our fractional reserve banking system creates debt money that we use as a substitute for real money. It also tells the Goldsmith story. In fact, it has a title, I think on page 3, Who Creates Our Money? And the first sentence says, private banks create almost all of our money. This is what we're trying to pose and change. The current system is really a mathematical impossibility. And you will see, and now I'm talking to somebody that hasn't learned about the system, you will see that the present system works very much like the monopoly game I just described, where the banker loans the money into circulation with an interest charge attached, instead of the government spending it into circulation as a tax-free, interest-free dividend for all. Just think that $689 billion that I mentioned every year for the last 5 years has been created in the form of increasing our total debts and increasing our total interest payments, when it could have been spent directly into circulation, reducing our debts and giving us these things. You know, we could have paid for the war, which should have never been fought, and we could have pay for the hurricanes and have money left over if we weren't borrowing it into circulation. We really do give away our money free of charge and then borrow it back from the same people we gave it to and pay them interest for the use of our own money. The fractional reserve banking system is the only reason that we're so deeply in debt today, and it must be changed. Just keep asking yourself this question. Again, I'm talking to the people that you're going to be talking to try and tell them about this problem. Why in the world do we let the privately owned banking system loan our own money into circulation as interest-bearing debt when we could spend it into circulation as a tax-free, interest-free dividend for the people of this country? Now, how deeply in debt are we? Our total debts, I'm talking now all debts, not just the national debt. National debt, state, county, and local debt, business debt, corporate debt, family debt, individual debt, all debted, all of our debt. In 1985, which is just 20 years ago, it totaled about $5 trillion. Today, in the Fed Flow of Funds report, which I looked at yesterday before I came over here, it totals almost $25 trillion. Our debt has quintupled in just 20 years. Under the present system, these debts are unpayable, and they are growing exponentially. and will soon reach the level where even the interest cannot be paid, let alone the principal. And even if we did try to pay off some of our debts, our money supply would be reduced by the amount we paid off because we don't have any real money. We circulate debt as a substitute for money, so when we pay off our debts, we also destroy part of our money supply. And as our money supply contracts, we go into recession and depression. It's a real catch-22. Until we eliminate fractional reserve banking and return the power to create and issue money to the federal government where it truly belongs, there is no way out. And I've just been throwing around trillions of dollars. Let's put $1 trillion in perspective. This is one way for you to realize how much $1 trillion really is. If you had gone into business the year that Christ was born, the year zero, and your business lost $1 million a day, every day, 365 days a year, you would not have lost $1 trillion until October of 2737. That's how big $1 trillion is. And we owe, our national debt is $8 trillion, and our total debts are $25 trillion. And to put compound interest into perspective, because that's what we're fighting under this system, if you had also in the year zero invested one lousy penny, 1 cent, at 4% compound interest, after 100 years, that penny would have grown to 50.5 cents. After 200 years, it would be $25.51. After 500 years, it would be $3,400,000. After 1,000 years, it would be more than $1,000 trillion. That's a 1 followed by 3, 6, 9, 12, 15 zeros. And in 2000, it would be the number 116 followed by 30 zeros, and I don't even know how to pronounce that. And compound interest is what is working against us in our present debt-based monetary system, which is why our total debt went from $5 trillion to $25 trillion in just 20 years. Think about where we're going to be in another 10 or 20 years if we don't change this system. Now, so far I've made this monopoly analogy presentation either in person or by email to about 50 people. Mostly these are people I have explained fractional reserve banking to before, and I thought they really understood it. Here's a typical reaction coming back. Dick, this is easier to understand, though overwhelming to accept. People have great difficulty accepting the fact that we are being ripped off by our monetary system the way we are. It goes against everything they have believed. Most people believe the government creates our own money and puts it into circulation, which of course is the way it should be. They are right in their belief, but they are wrong to believe that the system actually works this way. When they express disbelief that the system really does work the way I tell them it does, what you do then is refer them to this booklet on the web. Use that web address, the Google, and then go to the Modern Money Mechanics and let the Federal Reserve confirm what we're saying, because it confirms everything I've said, not in the words I use, but if you read what's in there, this is exactly where it works. This is the only way I think that we're going to get broad support that we will need in the future. We have to educate that 99.9%. We don't need to educate all of them, but we've got 300 million people. 1% of 300 million people is 3 million people. If we just got 3 million people across the country that were willing to write to their congressmen and their senators and ask them why they don't do something to change this, and soon we'll have a monetary bill. And hopefully in the next session of Congress, if we don't have the control we have now, perhaps we can get this bill introduced and get it a number. Then we have something else that we can use for validity and credibility, because believe me, people don't want to believe it works the way it does. And I guess that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Ben Geeson. I'm from Idaho Falls, and you'll learn a little bit about me later on when I give my presentation tomorrow. Titled The Chaos in Rural America. I'm going to make just a few comments, and then we're going to have a little fun after I make the comments, and I'll be short. We'll get done here. There is an ancient Chinese saying that goes something like this: wisdom begins by defining things accurately. Using terms such as money and means of exchange to define Federal Reserve notes and bank deposits is a very gross error. It is an intellectual meltdown. Instead, to understand Federal Reserve notes, bank deposit requires detailed explanations on the process of loan documents, repayment structure, collateral pledges, note maturities, cash flows, borrowers, creditors, and the laws behind these activities that result in the creation and destruction of Federal Reserve notes and bank deposits. All money comes out of the back end of a loan. Furthermore, out of the conceptual framework of banking law has grown an accounting framework of such size and scope that it literally directs every aspect of our human behavior, right down to how people even evaluate their own self-worth. It is laws that authorize the processes by which Federal Reserve notes and bank deposits are created, and in the term of their lives enjoy interest accruals. Is money the root of all evil? No, I'm afraid money is not the root of all evil. It is the root of all evil is the general ignorance of banking law, banking process, and accounting processes that result in all of our own enslavement. The monetary reform legislation that the American Monetary Institute is sponsoring is nothing more than an age-old process, a process of a citizenry that has endured injustices and is seeking to replace the offending legislation with something a whole lot better. Now we're going to have a little fun. I'm going to read a few quotes, and then I'll just wait a second and let you kind of in your own mind think about who might have said that, and then I'll tell you who said it. The bank hath benefit of interest on all monies which it creates out of nothing. William Patterson, founder of the Bank of England, which is basically the model after which the central bank in the United States is modeled. The bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create deposits, and with the flick of a pen, they'll create enough deposits to buy it back again. However, take it away from them, and all the great fortunes like mine will disappear. And they ought to disappear, for this would be a happier, better world to live in. But if you wish to remain slaves to the bankers and pay the cost of your own money, let them continue to create deposits. Sir Josiah Stamp, president of the Bank of England in 1920s and the second richest man in Britain at the time. Here's a cute one. I'm afraid the ordinary citizen would not like to be told that banks can and do create and destroy money. The amount of finance in existence varies only with the action of the banks in increasing or decreasing deposits and bank purchases. We know how this is effected. Every loan, overdraft, or bank purchase creates a deposit, and every repayment of a loan, overdraft, or bank sale destroys a deposit. And they who control the credit of the nation direct the policy of governments, hold in the hollow of their hands the destiny of the people. Reginald McKenna, former chairman of the Bank of Midland in England. This is the one that your friends will have fun with. Those few who can understand the system, checkbook money and credit, will either be so interested in its profits or so dependent on its favors that there will be little opposition from that class. While on the other hand, the great body of people, mentally incapable of comprehending the tremendous advantage that capital derives from the system, will bear its burdens without complaint, and perhaps without even suspecting that the system is inimical to their interests. Rothschild brothers out of London. What is a dollar? It is just something artificial we throw out there. What you're doing is fooling people. Dennis Karnofsky, senior chief economic advisor to the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. The failed attempts at influencing real economic activity in the late 60s and 70s are a clear warning of the damaging power of the central bank. Jerry Jordan, president of the Cleveland Federal Reserve Bank. In numerous years following the war, the federal government ran a heavy surplus. It could not, however, pay off its debt, retire its securities, because to do so meant there would be no bonds to back the national notes. To pay off the debt was to destroy the money supply. John Kenneth Galbraith. A couple more and we'll be done. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their money, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations will grow up around them, will deprive the people of their property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent that their fathers created or conquered. Thomas Jefferson, very good. One more. I have two great enemies, the Southern Army in front of me and the financial institutions to my rear. Of the two, the one in my rear is my greatest foe. Abe Lincoln. Thank you, folks.
The amount of inflation depends on the total amount of money that's created. It doesn't depend on the amount that the government creates alone. And I thought I made plain, and hope I did, and should have, that while I want increases in the percentage of our money that is created by the government, I want similar decreases in the percentage that is created by the banking system. And if we push one up and the other down in exactly the same ratio, then we wouldn't have any more inflation than we have now. Of course, we do have problems even now, but it's with the total money supply, not with the particular creator of that money supply.
If I could address that too, under the present system, we are more likely to have a shortage of money than we are to have a surplus of money. And to point this out statistically, the Federal Reserve's own figures show, as I mentioned, that our total debts right now, which is our total money, are $25 trillion, but our money supply, that is indicated as M1, M2, M3, and L by the Federal Reserve, our total money supply is $12 trillion. So if we tried to pay off all our debts today, we could only pay off $12 trillion of them, and we'd still owe $13 trillion. The problem is in the distribution of money, and the inflation only occurs when there's too many dollars chasing too few goods, and we certainly don't have that situation today. Just look at the poor people of New Orleans.
Inflation, it seems to me that inflation basically is a direct result of paying interest on money that we never, wasn't on.
Bill Abrams points up one point that's often overlooked, especially when the Fed is trying to control inflation by raising interest rates. That in itself is a cause of inflation.
I think we should give a little consideration here to the fact that all increases in prices is not the result of too much money chasing too few goods. We have a number of things happening in this economy that's causing prices to go up, and it has very little to do with the money supply. All of the environmental protection laws that we enact cause prices to go up. Everything that happens with petroleum cause prices to go up. And this is not a monetary phenomenon. Of course, there is such a thing as too much money chasing too few goods, and you can have inflation from that. But that's not the only reason prices are going up in this economy, and I think that's a factor that's very important for you to remember.
When the stock market fell in 2000, 2001, I don't remember when President Bush came on the TV and he assured the American public that there would be plenty of cash for them to withdraw if they wanted to go to the bank, so there would be no run on the banks, and there wasn't. And my question is, what mechanism or what regulations, policies guide the banks having a call on the Treasury to print money? And how does that get into the bank's hands? Do they do it every year? Do they do it as the credit supply increases?
Well, most of those were just established by law at the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Most popular, if there was a run on a bank, for example, if you're in a community, there was a run on a bank, what that bank would do is it would go on and borrow what they call overnight funds, Fed funds from other banks. And so they would borrow that money, deposit it at the Federal Reserve, and then the teller goes in and says, my vault's out of cash, and she fills out a little form. They run it up the line, and then they debit the bank's checking account at the Federal Reserve and load it up on cash in one of these trucks and send it up to the bank, and so they give them out all their deposits. The way the system originally worked is they had a discount window. And what banks could do, and they do that very little now. Most of the bank's liquidity is one bank loaning another bank money. But in earlier times, the discount window was just a function. If the bank was short of liquidity, let's say somebody felt uncomfortable about the bank could go and pledge its loans and buy the cash and meet its customers' needs. So there's really two functions in place, and they've been in place since for many years. And one is borrowing liquidity from another bank, or pledging your loans and borrowing from the Federal Reserve.
Hi, my name is Rick Cook, and I do work for the U.S. Treasury Department. I may be the only greenbacker there, but and I've known Steve for quite some time, and I'm a very strong supporter. And a couple of the questions have been asked here, very, very critical questions that I think everyone in this room, many of the people do have the information with regard to inflation, relation of the money supply to inflation, how the Federal Reserve System works. But these are all kind of basic issues that everybody needs to really get very familiar with. And I think the best way to start is with Steve's book. Basically, the way the money gets introduced through the Federal Reserve System is they purchase U.S. Debt instruments, bills and bonds, and then that becomes part of their reserve base against which they lend. So, the government goes into debt, and that's why they're afraid that if the government runs a surplus, there's no more money. When Clinton ran 4 years of a surplus, people were panicking because the government wasn't in debt anymore, and so you couldn't use their debt as your reserve base. So we're going to run out of money to lend, and that was a big problem. So that's something that people really need to take a look at. The other thing I think that is very, very critical for us all to understand is that government-issued money, aka greenbacks, does not cause inflation. That was an issue that, of course, has been used against the whole concept of greenback funding for many, many years. But even today, the economic researchers who go back and look at the greenback era acknowledge that the real source of inflation post-Civil War was the large amount of national banking notes coming into the system because it's debt-based money that causes inflation. Greenbacks themselves are not inflationary. They're not an inflationary issue. And this is something that is very, very important that we all understand. It's the boom and bust cycles that are caused by alternating inflationary bubbles, and then the bursting of those bubbles, known as recessions and depressions, that are the true sources of inflation. And I think if you look at the current housing bubble, you'll get an idea of how that works. But again, this is a really, really critical issue. But I've got to say, having studied it and worked with Steve on this, a straight government issue of money in terms of payment for goods and services is not in itself inflationary. It's much more complex than that. So it's not something to worry about, but it is something to understand. And I think just start with Steve's book and take it from there.
On the subject of greenbacks, I just wanted to add this. At the time the greenbacks were issued, that was back when Abraham Lincoln was president, and there was no Federal Reserve System. Each bank produced its own banknotes. Today, if we spent greenbacks into circulation, it would be to the benefit of the government, but as soon as these hit checking account deposits, where most of them would go, they become new reserves for the banking industry on which they could expand by a factor of, well, today it'd be a factor of almost 20 because the reserve requirements have been lowered as of last December. But the point I'm making is Abraham Lincoln could do that without creating inflation because they were spent into circulation, but they weren't multiplied. Today, if they were spent into circulation, the fractional reserve system would multiply them with a 5% reserve against demand deposits by a factor of 20. So for every greenback that came into circulation, there'd be 19 more dollars of debt created.
David Hershey, by the way, used to be a bank examiner in his deep past, so he has some experience in this area.
I just wanted to address the fears of inflation, because that is a topic that will come up and that we do need to have an answer for, I think, when we talk about the government spending dollars into existence and paper money systems. There's a great fear that you can't control the government's expenditures, and it's just going to cause runaway inflation. So the solution to that, in my mind, is Frederick Soddy's solution, who Steve refers to in his book and gives prominent place to Frederick Soddy. He recommended setting up a separate government agency like the weights, or putting at least the responsibility under an agency such as the U.S. Weights and Measures Agency that would monitor the pricing and use an inflation index targeting based on an established index, and either spend money into existence or bring it out of existence and destroy it to keep that inflation index or price index at a certain level. So that's one way of reassuring people that this new system would not get out of hand and cause inflation, is to have an agency in charge of maintaining a price target on a specified index. By the way, inflation index targeting is really a hot topic in Washington right now when they talk about replacing Alan Greenspan. One of the prominent predecessors, Ben Bernanke, is a big advocate of inflation index targeting. So it's something that's politically palatable, has a lot of credibility these days too. So something I believe we should be behind.
I have a question. A question that I've somewhat been bothered by. And so I'll throw it out, not only to these folks, but maybe somebody in the audience can answer the question too. I'm going to have to use this board over here to illustrate my point. It was in the early 1900s when this September Barron's article came out, written by a Catherine Welling. And this is what was said. Because I always felt that the creation of money should match the increase of goods and services. That would protect one from having inflation. If you are increasing the economy in a genuine way, then you have less fear for inflation. Is that basically true? Yeah. Okay. Then here, follow me. Of all the money created by commercial banks in 1997, $125 billion was loaned to purchase investment securities. In fact, from 1990 to 1999, a period of 8 years and 3 months, the stock market capitalization went up 3.54 trillion to 15.97 trillion. During the same period, the value of America's GDP went up 5.74 trillion to 8.81 trillion. Now, here's the point. 1990 to 1999, a period of 8 years, 3 months. Okay, so this is where it comes to the question that I'm wondering if it's correct. That the stock market capitalization swelled 12.43 trillion, but the GDP only 3.67 trillion. And here's the therefore. In summary, then, the stock market was covered by only 24.7% of the real growth of goods and services measured by GDP. Does that mean then, which this next sentence says, that 75.3% of the increase in money was backed by nothing? Is there a problem then? You bet. Okay. Thank you.